For those not familiar with the Good Governance Academy, we're a non-profit organisation that was established by Professor Mervyn King in 2019. We collaborate with universities, business schools, professional bodies, and other organisations around the world to educate and empower leadership to drive ethical and sustainable change. We run regular webinars on the current topics, and if you'd like to see what we have planned, please head over to our events page, which I'll post a link to in the chat window below. I'd also encourage you to join our mailing list and follow us on LinkedIn to be kept informed of forthcoming events. In addition to those webinars, we host colloquia twice a year. Invites have just gone out for our 12th colloquia in November, so please check that out. These are high-profile events which have been attended by thousands of people, and the output of these is shared with our support member network, which reaches over 5 million people. We also run showcase events to promote courses which the Academy has endorsed. The endorsement program is available to any organisation and involves an assessment to ensure the highest standards are maintained. The courses we endorse are those we feel address business critical issues and align with our own focus areas. The next showcase, which runs on the 24th of October, will feature Executive Education Online. Something else we're delighted to offer our community is the opportunity to hear from authors whose books we feel offer valuable insights into the challenges we face as governance professionals and as business leaders. And if you missed the sessions we run earlier this year, please head over to our YouTube channel where you can find recordings of the Corporate Revolutionary, 5 Generations of Work, and The Healthy Company. This brings me to today's webinar, which I'm very excited to be hosting. When I read Alison's book, Higher Ground, earlier this year, I found it so refreshing. One of my primary objectives, or the primary objective of the GGA, is to share information which empowers people to make changes in their organisation. But something that I've become very aware of is the sheer amount of questionable guidance, training, and content that's available. And I think it's led business leaders to be overwhelmed and unable to focus their attention where it's needed. Alison's book takes a step back from all this and highlights that there are some fundamental things that you need to pay attention to. There are some traps that you can easily fall into, but with some conventional wisdom and common sense, you'll be on the right track. Alison also provides these neat steps to higher ground at the end of each chapter, which nicely summarise where we should be focusing our attention. So Alison, thanks for bearing with me during my not so short introduction. I hope we'll have some time left to review your book. It's wonderful to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. I've been looking forward to this conversation since we arranged it back in August, but since then I've really been enjoying your candid posts on LinkedIn. So if I can hand over to you now, please can we start with you telling us about yourself and any key moments or forks in the road that led you to where you are today?
Sure thing, and thank you so much for having me, and I'm loving seeing the massive geographic spread of the comments in the chat. So we've got people from all over the world, which is amazing. So yeah, and thank you for your kind words. I am a clinical professor, which is like a professor of practice at NYU Stern School of Business. Until very recently, I was also the executive director of a think tank called Ethical Systems that focuses on bringing behavioral science ideas from academia into the corporate sector. And as you said in your introduction, the book really starts from the perspective that we've become wildly confused about what it means to be a good or ethical business today, to the degree we're all drowning in jargon and we don't even know whether we're talking about the same things. I mean, there's a massive debate going on at the moment, for example, about whether we should rename ESG as if that will solve all the problems and controversies with it. And I suppose the background to the book is partly about my career. I spent 12 years working in corporate investigations. Actually, I worked in sub-Saharan Africa for a very big chunk of this. So in the early 2000s, did a lot of work on corruption, political risk, really got interested in the question of how Western multinationals operate in countries that we used to think of as high-risk emerging markets. Though these days, the United States is probably the highest risk emerging market out there. We're not really enjoying the run-up to the election right now and doesn't seem to be going in a very good direction. But it used to be that we would say these things about countries in Africa. Now I don't think we've got a leg to stand on. Anyway, in that role, I spent a lot of time working with lawyers and bankers and compliance officers about regulatory risk, you know, about corruption, about money laundering, terrorist financing, political risk, very sort of high stakes things. And it was always the legal teams and the financial teams that were front and center here. And then after a while, Well, one thing you learn if you work in corporate investigations is that the facts don't matter nearly as much as leadership or culture. So how leadership teams responded to what we found, I thought was super fascinating and revealing about culture and ethics in organizations. And so I started to ask a lot of questions about those topics, but then ultimately found my way into what we usually these days call sustainability or ESG. And then I thought I would find the answers to the outstanding questions I had. I thought I would be in a world with a different frame and a different vision. I wanted to work on topics like climate change and human rights. But what I found most of all was that there was a completely different jargon, mindset, terminology, view of the firm. And I just became super interested in this disconnect. I became super interested in the fact that risk and compliance people don't really talk to sustainability people. We have different theories of change, different visions, different philosophies. And I started to ask all these kind of awkward questions about why things are the way they are. And so what the book tries to do is not be kind of deep in the world of compliance or deep in the jargon of sustainability or deep in the jargon of culture, which we can probably all recognize are three different worlds with three different sets of conferences and so on. So your organization being an honorable exception. And so what I tried to do is kind of pull a red thread through and sort of ask the question. I mean, we're all obsessed with the hypocrisy of business leaders, but actually I meet a lot of business leaders trying to do the right thing that are sort of overwhelmed with bad advice. So I tried to, in good faith, answer that question. If you wanted to run an ethical business today, how would you go about that? What would you do? What would you focus on? How would you think about various questions? And so, yeah, that's the book, the question the book tries to answer.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alison. It's an incredibly interesting and varied career. And when I think of your work, especially in anti-corruption, it's incredibly brave what you've done. So you've no doubt met some very dubious characters along the way, but also many who may have inspired or guided you, some of who
Yes.
are referenced in the book. So I'd like to move on to that now. So we're better to start than that, to start with chapter 1. You open the book by asking why running a business got so complicated. And that's a question I've often pondered. Generally, I look for the simplest solution to any problem. So surely if we focus on doing the right thing in the right way, we'll be all right. But of course, it's a bit more involved than that. I've always assumed that if something isn't being done right, it's because the person in question either doesn't have the will or they lack the capability. I've never really considered the conflicting pressures these people might be dealing with. You talk in the book about pressures from different groups, from investors, consumers, employees, and activists. They're all expecting companies to solve the ethical challenges they deem important, but of course, each group's focus can differ significantly. Can you tell us about your experience with that?
Yeah, so maybe, just to kind of take a step back, and, the conversation is obviously different in a country like South Africa, but in the US and maybe globally, we had this consensus from, let's say, the end of the Cold War until pretty recently, that the focus of business is to maximize shareholder value. You just maximize shareholder value. You don't break the law. We all know that Milton Friedman kind of came up with these ideas. And nobody really in the mainstream, I think, questioned those ideas until very recently. ESG was coined in 2004, but was pretty niche until the late 2010s. And then you saw this big rhetorical shift. It happened at the World Economic Forum. It happened at this very powerful group of CEOs, the Business Roundtable. It happened with big investors like Larry Fink. So there was a rhetorical shift towards stakeholder capitalism, and we will run our business in the interests of all stakeholders. And that's great. I'm down with that as a philosophical shift. But what I think is less discussed is the number of practical challenges that introduces. So we have a very kind of abstract discussion in the media. Gillian Tett in the Financial Times recently talked about the stakeholder doctrine. So we're talking about this like it's a religion or a sort of philosophical contest. But what I really see is that CEOs, they know they can't say, we're just going to focus on shareholder value and not break the law. I mean, good luck attracting a consumer or employee under 30 if you're going to take that stance. But I think on the other side of the spectrum, there's now a chorus of voices that are, many of whom I know in the sustainability community, where you kind of get the impression that nothing you ever do will be good enough. And so I think all of this kind of rhetoric of we work to balance the interests of all stakeholders is kind of practical and unworkable if different stakeholder groups want different things. I think it's led to a lot of ticking the box. I think it's led to a lot of over-promising. More recently, it's led to a lot of very understandable pressure on greenwashing and hypocrisy. And it all, I think, comes from this view that if we just treat responsible business as PR, if we just put out a nice kind of networking, marketing message, then we'll have a better reputation and stakeholders will leave us alone. So we're still, I think, trying to kind of tell a defensive story, either to deflect the regulator or to reflect the general public. We're still treating this as a form of stealth marketing, and it's not working. So we I think get into this situation where there's enormous unconvincing over-promising, and then we get into these expectations that we have that business should solve very, very intractable problems: biodiversity, inequality, child labor, climate change. I'm not saying business isn't responsible for a lot of these problems or doesn't pay a lot of, causal, play a big causal role. But I think we've kind of got into this situation where many businesses are saying all the right things, saying they're committed to climate change, etc. They're very often lobbying in completely a different direction. Very often behind the scenes, there's not the kind of commitment you might think is going on. So I think we've got ourselves into trouble with this rhetoric. I think we've got ourselves into an over-promising situation. And I think we need to find a path forward that's a bit more focused and restrained and honest, that doesn't suggest we can just ignore wider social and environmental externalities and consequences, but nor can an individual business take on everything. We've got to think about the role of the government. We've got to think about the role of other institutions and so on.
Okay, wonderful. Talking further about conflicting pressures, while I was cyber stalking you, as one does, I came across Morgan Hamill, who created, in partnership with the CPA in Canada, the government certificate in de-Polarisation, which you're on the faculty for. Now, I've not seen anything like that before, so I got in touch and she graciously spent some time on the phone with me talking about her ethical clothing company and how experiences that company highlighted how difficult it is to operate a business that claims to be ethical, who wants to be ethical, and yet still doesn't keep everyone happy all the time. And it made me realize that just doing the right thing isn't enough, because my view of what's right might not be the same as yours. And even if we have ethical lenses, we want things, we've got different perspectives to consider. So Morgan explained that her inability to keep spinning these plates led her to make the heartbreaking decision to close that business. But she does now use that experience to help guide other companies through their ethical challenges. And I'd encourage people to check out her TED Talks and other interviews to hear more about de-Polarisation. I'll share some links in the chat below. But going back to what I mentioned before about my view of people not doing the right things being simply because there's no will or no skill, after speaking to Morgan, I realized that I and probably many others may not have been fair to those leaders that we criticize for making decisions that we view as wrong or even crazy, without really understanding how they arrived at those decisions. So as someone who's spent many hours consulting with people in power, do you believe that we as a society, as employees, as activists, are too quick to judge those in power? And do you think there's more that they can do or that we can do to appreciate why certain decisions are being made?
What a great question. I have a chapter about leadership in my book, and it was the hardest one to write. So I would like to sort of start off by saying that. I think it is genuinely difficult with the best will in the world to manage these trade-offs and be focused and be everywhere at once and meet these very, very contradictory expectations. That said, I still see a lot of people at the top of businesses who feel impelled, for whatever reason, to project confidence about everything. I think there's this fascinating paradox where, we talk about the long term a lot in sustainable business. We don't even know what's going to happen in the short term. I mean, we've never been in a more disruptive and turbulent world. Yet it still seems borderline impossible for today's CEOs to say, I don't know. What do you think? I don't know what's going to happen. COVID is an unprecedented situation. Maybe we should experiment with remote work and measure what's good or bad for our culture before making a decision. Instead, you've got to kind of, this is right for our culture to go back 5 days a week, or we're going to be remote first. And so you still, I think, see this kind of valorization of certain very big egos and very big personalities. I'm sure we can all think of examples of this in the public domain. And so I think there's this sort of paradox where we do need to transform leadership. There's very, very interesting evidence from job descriptions showing that we're looking for different skills in today's leaders. We're looking for the ability to influence diffuse networks. We're looking for a bit more humility. We're looking for social skills, knowledge of sustainability, coupled with inclusion. And so there is, I think, this new vision of leadership. I don't think it is possible anymore to get away with barking orders from the top. But at the same time, we've put today's CEOs there because they are overconfident and risk-taking and able to kind of provide this vision. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that we need to move more to this idea of leadership as a collective problem. We need to think more about ethics as a collective problem of involving employees in decisions, of encouraging them to use principles, not just imposing rules. But at the same time, I think our expectations of leaders are still that they're going to solve all our problems. And so I do think, one, we're sometimes expecting traits that don't exist in the same person. And then two, I think we are probably in need of generational shifts for a lot of this to take shape. So I do think we're seeing a new generation of leaders and CEOs emerging. But for people still at the top of companies today, I think they're struggling with this new world.
Yeah, absolutely. In a recent interview with Strategy in Business, you mentioned that if you're trying to run a company, you're caught between two visions. You've got Friedman's shareholder value focus on one side and the pro ESG, everything everywhere all at once, neither of which are feasible. You said that many business leaders feel trapped. If we could do one thing to help them, and by we, I mean, groups we've mentioned, investors, employees, etc., what would it be?
I mean, I think we've got to get clear on where we would like them to focus. I mean, to go more into the ESG conversation, I don't think we are clear in the responsible business community. Are we looking for companies to meet the floor on a broad range of issues, in which case something like a regulated ESG reporting regime might work? Are we trying to get them to be more ethical and clean up their messes and take care of their impact? In which case, it's pretty fascinating how much people in ESG like to say that the conversation's nothing to do with ethics and all about strategic advantage. Or are we hoping that they will focus on particular material topics to drive strategic advantage, in which case there's a trade-off with the kind of breadth and tick box compliance reporting we need? So I don't think we're clear whether we're trying to raise the floor, drive strategic advantage, whether we'd like companies to focus on one thing or cover all bases, whether we're trying to penalize irresponsibility or kind of solve the climate crisis. I don't think we're clear what we're doing. And so the reaction is this sort of tick box over promising, this laundry list of all the wonderful stuff they're doing. It's not convincing. I think all of this became clear to me when Patagonia handed over ownership of its business to a non-profit foundation. Now, Patagonia, as we all know, is this big sustainability poster child. When I ask my students to name a responsible business, and they all put their hands up, and then I say, you're not allowed to say Patagonia, and they all put their hands down. I mean, it's fascinating in itself. I think that no one can think of anyone else very easily. But Patagonia handed over ownership of its business to a charity. And on my social media feed, at least, it took a few hours before people started saying, well, employees haven't even got a stake, and the business model's still based on plastic, and this is just about tax avoidance. And so if even Patagonia can't get away with doing something without everybody attacking them, then what hope does everybody else have? I mean, a final thing is, we have this notion, I think, in the responsible business world that we're trying to sort good from bad businesses, clean from dirty businesses. That's playing out very badly because arguably, right, what we need to do is get the dirty businesses to clean up. So in that case, ESG ratings might be counterproductive. So I think there are all these kind of nuances and complexities that are now coming to the fore with the messaging that we're putting out there. I think we need to be a bit more restrained and thoughtful and realistic, and try to come up with a coherent view of what we think a leader should be doing, rather than yelling at them about everything under the sun.
Yeah, no. Going back to shareholders and the investor community, and this is personally where I see there's significant challenges, but also some great opportunities for ethics. If I'm to take a moment to go back in our own history, the history of the GGA, to when Professor King was first asked to create the King Code of Corporate Governance. The Cadbury report in the UK, the first corporate governance code in the world, had not long been released, and that focused on shareholder primacy. The South African Institute of Directors asked Professor King, following Mandela's election that year, this is 94, to create something similar here in order to support the movement of South Africa to become a country of equal opportunity. With Mr. Mandela's blessing, Professor King agreed that there were two conditions, and the first was that it must focus on the needs, interests, and expectations of major stakeholders, not shareholders. And despite Professor King being a judge, he was the youngest ever in South Africa, he was adamant the code should not be legislated. His fear that it would become a mindless tick box exercise.
Right.
And his hope was that the code would be enforced through peer pressure and organisations wanting to be seen as good corporate citizens. So since then, there's been a global acceptance of that view, and we've seen a shift away from pure shareholder focus in terms of governance. But it still seems to me that the investor community are the puppet masters with the ability, just with their sentiment, if not their actual investments, to drive certain behaviours in our leadership. So with integrated reporting and sustainability reporting, we're considering a lot more information in the company financials. But here again, there's some confusion or maybe disillusionment, because ethics and sustainability measures such as ESG, they're really becoming risk calculations rather than a means to measure an organisation's intrinsic value. So I'm keen to hear what your views are on the investor community and the impact that they have on driving certain behaviours in our leadership.
Well, there's so much to say about this, right? I mean, I think the first thing is, if we look at the state of the oil industry right now, what investors might say they prioritize and how they're actually behaving are somewhat mixed messages. I think the second thing we might talk about is ESG reporting. I tend to take the position that we are dramatically overestimating the degree to which even a very well-informed investor, let alone an average stakeholder or member of the public, can evaluate corporate performance on ESG issues based solely on these disclosures. You hear a lot of, if we can just get these regimes aligned, we can have apples to apples comparisons, then everything will be solved. And I would kind of make the point, if you're trying to compare, let's say, the water use of Pepsi versus Coca-Cola, which you would think that's an apples to apples comparison. One, they have very different business models. And then two, what water are we even talking about? Are we talking about the water in the bottle of Coke? Are we talking about the water in the transportation process? Are we talking about the water used to grow the sugar, etc.? So I think there's a big focus on these reporting regimes and alignment and consistency, but I'm not sure it's going to be the silver bullet that many people think it is. Then we've obviously got the question about short-term versus long-term and the pressure on quarterly reporting. And it seems to me that many corporations these days are basically involved in financial engineering as much as anything else. Weighing against all that, we've got this conversation about the universal owner thesis. So if you are a company like BlackRock, if you are one of these enormous asset management companies, the argument goes, you're exposed to the whole economy. So even if you might be able to make a lot of money betting on Exxon, if you're also invested in Walmart or Costco or something like that, you are exposed if, you know, the operations flood, you are exposed to the consequences of climate change and inequality and that kind of thing. So there is an argument that with a big enough, broad enough investment portfolio, you start to become more pro-social. You start to have an interest in topics like climate change and democracy. I think the evidence on that is certainly mixed, but you know, that I think is an interesting kind of counter to what's going on here. And then the final thing I would say is we tend to talk about investors as if they're monolithic. We talk about them as if they're all kind of Carl Icahn or Bill Ackman. But the reality is you and I are investors. If you've got a pension, you are also an investor. So different investors have differentiated views. And one thing I think you can do if you're running a company today is choose your investors. Choose investors that are more long-term, that are more responsible, that are going to be involved in your decisions to kind of prepare your company to survive and thrive over the long term. You don't have to work with a load of hedge funds. I mean, Paul Polman is famous for a reason because he stopped quarterly reporting right after he took over Unilever. And think of a company like Amazon that has said for its whole history, you know, we are going to think long term, do not expect to pay off immediately. So I think corporations tend to be like, oh, it's just what investors want. I think you've got a little bit more power to influence this than you might think.
Yeah. And just talking about asset managers, you mentioned in your book that Boston Common Asset Management had forced Visa and Netflix to change their behavior because they were lobbying. You've changed their lobbying practices, basically. But I wonder whether Boston also looks into other unethical practices in these businesses. I expect not, or at least not to the same extent.
Probably not, but the lobbying conversation is very important. I like the way that investors are focused on that.
True. Staying on the topic of investors, and you mentioned Bill Ackman, you recently facilitated a TED Talk with him.
Yeah.
He's a activist. He's been well spoken out against poor governance in well-known institutions. He fully supports the freedom of speech and the right to publicly express opinions, etc. He's not a fan of the DEI movement, but he does believe in opportunity for everyone, regardless of background. And this, he was saying, is the cornerstone of organizational culture. And he believes that organizational culture should be the top of mind for boards and executives. And in a quote that Morgan recently posted from David Buck, a professor of strategy and political economy in Switzerland, he said that there is a difference between being committed to DEI in your HR policies and making that a pillar of your company's external positioning. And I think this is what Bill was alluding to with the DEI movement. Action speaks louder than words. And I have to say, in that interview, I liked what he said. He seemed like a level-headed guy, which probably isn't common for billionaires. But I started thinking this, we need to clone this guy. But after following him on X, I think my views differ slightly. But
yeah, yes.
I do like what he said around governance and you mentioned in your book, we shouldn't need to have the right behaviours and actions prescribed to us. Having said that, governance still seems to be a tick box, compliance-driven practice where the core value is lost, common sense leaves the building, and is replaced by thousands of billable hours from consulting firms. So it seems that we're well beyond the point of enabling or even allowing organizations to do what they think is best without wading through needless bureaucracy. But my question here is, even if we could reduce the amount of red tape, isn't there a danger that if we don't prescribe these things, if we don't map them out in frameworks and policies, that these monolithic organizations will just take the path of least resistance and continue acting in their own interests?
I think that is quite true. And I think we're certainly, if you look at the story of anti-corruption, for example, you see the effectiveness of what happens when you make something legally required. I mean, you're seeing a big discussion going on in the EU right now that's mainly about the compliance burden and mainly people complaining. But certainly, suddenly the lawyers, the compliance people, senior leadership teams are taking this seriously. So it's not, I don't think that that regulation is a problem or we don't need it. I think the problem is more that these frameworks, concepts, et cetera, this guidance have kind of jumped the shark. I mean, I think it's they've got a little bit out of hand. I spoke at a conference recently about the tea industry, and the speaker before me had a slide, and he was like, here are all the sustainability standards that apply to this industry. There are at least 40 frameworks on this slide. And I could kind of hear a collective sigh in the room. I also find myself quite frequently in the supermarket being like, well, what coffee am I allowed to buy? There are all these labels on everything. It's really confusing. So I understand the hunt for a kind of simple solution that will make things okay. But I think it is a case really of an organization putting ethics at the center of what it's doing. I think it is a case of being much more focused and realistic. I think you really need to take a view that you can't overpromise. I think you need to focus on making your business better before you go out there promising to make the world better. And I would frankly like to see more businesses paying a living wage and thinking about their supply chains and treating the people that they impact with dignity and respect, and a little bit less promising to, solve systemic racism or climate change and making these big promises at Davos. I'd like to see less treating responsible business as PR and more meaningful action. And I think we're all collectively kind of exhausted with the way that where we've got to. I was just at Climate Week in New York, and I really think we're kind of facing a reckoning for many of the things that we said. We've said for a long time, we can just get companies to disclose, then accountability will somehow magically result. And I think we can really question whether that's happening.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I see so often, especially on LinkedIn, that people have specific titles which suggest that they're the oracle within their company on ethics or sustainability or ESG. All of these are critical topics that span entire organizations and may affect thousands of people. And I think, okay, if they're the champions of this behavior or way of working, then that's great. But so often they're not. They're the start and the end point. Their remit is to manage reporting in those areas or talk with some degree of confidence on those matters, just to assuage leadership fears of non-compliance. They're basically just another silo. They're not making it to embed the right culture across the organization, and they probably don't have the right executive support to do that anyway. In any work I've been involved in, we always, if we're trying to affect change, we've always tried to focus on the top-down approach. But what happens when that doesn't work? In your book, you mentioned there's the tone at the top becoming the tone in the middle. And in your experience, is there any point even trying to drive change if you don't have executive buy-in?
Well, I think without executive buy-in, it's very, very difficult to get anything done. Whether you're a head of compliance or a head of sustainability, you're probably either a member of the maybe you're a member of the C-suite at best, maybe not even. So if the tone at the top is not there, if the leadership commitment is not there, then I think it's going to be very, very difficult to get anything done. But as you just said, even if the tone at the top and the commitment is there, I think we are making a mistake in thinking we can treat responsible business like a CRM rollout, that we can kind of cascade it down from the top. We set goals, we set objectives, we sit back and, wait for it all to happen. Not least because very often it's the people, the more junior people in the organization that are more knowledgeable and passionate about these topics. And then I think, what you really need to do, of course, is to build ethical and sustainable considerations into incentives, into structures, into the core of the business. And I think you're exactly right. Both compliance and sustainability tend to sit on the sidelines. And that kind of siloed approach that then leaders think they can delegate these problems to a chief of someone and forget about them. It's not working. And so my book discusses a number of things that we might do about this. I talk about a couple of Dutch banks that have ethics committees where they include junior people. They have really involved discussions about strategic issues. Should we invest in GMOs? Should we invest in casinos? What do we do about AI? And they bring the questions to the table and debate them and set principles, thinking about the mission and ideas of the business. So I think that's the kind of thing we need. What we keep doing is imposing rules. Don't do this, don't do that, sign this process, sign this agreement. That's becoming more and more of a problem, not least because the law is becoming more and more complex and in fact globally inconsistent. And cognitively, people can't handle those many rules, even if they think the rules are fair and aren't inclined to break them. So, I think that's part of the problem. I think we're also, very interestingly, delegating stakeholder management very often to heads of sustainability. If you look at chief sustainability officers' job descriptions, they often include stakeholder engagement. I find that really interesting because I think we're saying implicitly that the rest of the business can carry on thinking about shareholders because we've delegated stakeholder conversations to some usually quite powerless and underfunded part of the business. So I think that's very revealing. And in general, right, we've got this problem that if a new problem comes up, the view of the C-suite is just get a chief, chief happiness officer, chief medical officer, chief AI officer. And so that kind of notion of let's have a chief DEI officer, ask them to solve racism in a year with no budget, reporting into HR, and then fire them if they don't do it, that's not working either. So we need to find a way to bring the whole organization to the table. We need to have more integrated governance. Very, very hard to do that, I think, without diluting accountability. So I have a go at these conversations in the book, but I think there's a lot more to say and work on there, quite honestly. I think I tried to put suggestions out there, but I think we need to collectively come up with some better solutions for these problems.
In one of your later chapters, you talk about grounding values in how you impact human beings, and this is a great way to reduce silos. But this is another example of how simply doing the right thing isn't really as easy as you'd expect. Treat people fairly and you'll be fine. But human rights is a broad topic, and some guidance even seems contradictory. And you mentioned in your book how BSR, a sustainable business consultancy, have been brought in to help Facebook with competing human rights pressures around user privacy and sharing malicious content. You also talk about how companies are making great progress here, such as Diageo, who have made their entire executive team responsible for human rights, and they look at impact before risk when prioritising focus areas. Could you talk to us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe where I should start answering this question is when I tell people, I don't know if you have this experience as well, Mark, when I tell people I work on questions of ethical business, I mean, the most common response is, oh, well, isn't that an oxymoron? Or they need all the help they can get. But then people also say, well, values, ethics, no one agrees. Different people have different beliefs. The world's very polarized and divided, all of which is true. And I think there is this kind of question of, how do you operate globally? If you're a Danish company, do you say we've got Danish values everywhere? Well, that's not going to work, What do you do with your LGBTQ employees in Saudi Arabia? So we do have this issue of what values mean in this world that's really geopolitically fraught and contested. I make the argument fairly strongly that I believe the best place to ground your ethical principles today is in human rights frameworks. I think we've discussed already, focusing on the law and legal compliance isn't going to cut it. I think we've discussed already the challenges with trying to set coherent ESG goals. I like human rights because they're non-partisan. I like human rights because I think it's incontestable that nobody wants to have values that they do not share imposed on them. You're right that human rights can contradict each other, but there is a body of law considering these trade-offs. And then I think, human beings need to be treated with dignity and respect. We all care deeply about fairness. And so when people say to me, well, nobody agrees on all these questions, and, this is a raging issue in the US where we're so polarized and we really dislike each other, then I say, well, okay, but is it really true that we are that divided on values? Is it really true that anyone thinks it's okay that the rail company Norfolk Southern lobbied against safety regulations and then flooded a town in Ohio with toxic chemicals? Is it really okay that McKinsey's just been fined nearly $800 million for working for both the regulator and an opioid manufacturer at the same time? Is it okay that Merck, the car company, has just paid another fine of, I think, $168 million for having its customers arrested for saying they're stealing cars that they're not in fact stealing? Is it okay that Amazon made warehouse workers work around a dead body all day? I don't think anybody of any political persuasion thinks any of that is okay. So we can all sit there and suck our teeth and say values are contested, and I'm not saying that's wrong. But actually, I think all of the examples I just shared stem from companies not treating human beings with dignity and respect. So in some ways, it is that simple.
True. Going back to chapter 3, you take us through how aiming to be a responsible business can become a tangle of traps. And you talked about how zero tolerance is a catch-all that doesn't necessarily catch all. Balancing stakeholder needs, as we've discussed, is fine, but you can't please everyone all the time. What surprised me, although it makes total sense now, is that being transparent opens you up to unfair scrutiny. And it seems if you keep your head down and fly under the radar, no one's going to notice you. But if you come out with some bold social environmental claim that may well be true and fair, you're kind of painting a target on your back that the activists quickly pay attention to, not for the right reasons. So is this a result of kind of lazy activism, picking on the peacocks, or is it an odd form of raising awareness to drive more change?
Yeah, so my personal favorite chapter in the book is the chapter on transparency, because I did try to say something counterintuitive. And we do have in ESG the idea that if we just get everyone to report, then problems will magically get solved, though we never quite describe how that's going to happen. We've also said, of course, to businesses, just set a strategy and set sustainability targets and think about all your stakeholders and you'll have a better reputation. It's in fact not true. So if you look at what activist campaigns, if you look at what activists are doing and saying, you will see very clear evidence that NGO activists target the best performers and the worst performers. Yes, they target the ExxonMobils for obvious reasons, but they also do target leading companies like Unilever and Starbucks and Patagonia. That's not necessarily because they're lazy, though some of them are, but what they're trying to do is move practice in a whole sector. And if you can target and get a leader to move, everyone else will be under pressure to move. So activist targets corporate undermining of labor unions is the norm in America. Starbucks is far from alone. Starbucks is objectively one of the best performers in the restaurant sector in terms of not just sustainability, but employee benefits and how it treats employees in general. So we could say that the campaign against Starbucks is somewhat unfair, but if you get Starbucks to move, then the Dunkin' Donuts and these other coffee chains are also under pressure. So it makes total strategic sense to do this. The problem is if we're telling corporate leaders, just have a nice strategy and a glossy report and everything will be okay, that's actually not true. So we need to be more realistic. I mean, I think we've gone out there telling CEOs, just do this, do this, do this, and everything will be great. One of the reasons everyone's not doing it is that it's far harder than it looks. And a lot of the things we've said are in fact not true and not convincing.
Sure. In chapter 9, you look at rethinking ethical cultures. And I'd like to open here with a quote. You said that if your company is heading for an ethics scandal, this will frequently show up in its culture long before the problem is discovered. The issue isn't that the signs aren't visible, it's that no one is looking. And in 2015, you conducted a study with experts. They agreed that unethical cultures have much in common. There's an urge to seek market dominance at any cost. Do you think there's value in boards requiring management to conduct regular culture assessments with the aim of highlighting these damaging behaviours before they make the newspapers?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you could nail the culture assessment challenge, you'd also, as an investor, make unbelievable amounts of money. We all know that that 70% of M&A deals fail, for example, for culture reasons. We also know that now we're in this very transparent, social media-driven environment. The internal culture is on full display as never before. Think about the aftermath of Elon Musk acquiring Twitter. We saw this blow-by-blow account of what's going on. We see all these leaks. We see employees filming themselves being laid off and putting it on TikTok. So culture's always been a source of strategic advantage, and these days more than ever. I think the problem is it's very easy to think culture's sort of fuzzy and vague, and what is it anyway, and how do you measure it? Much easier to measure a compliance program or training, how many people completed the training. So I think people naturally default to these things that are easier to measure. And then I think there's a tendency to sort of have employee engagement surveys and then be like, we've got a score of 90% and everyone loves working here, which is another way of treating culture as PR. So I think you've got to, yes, I certainly would agree that you should measure your culture and your ethical culture specifically very rigorously. There's actually a page on the Ethical Systems website with all the most credible culture assessment tools that we think are out there. So people can look at those and explore those tools. I think, again, we need to kind of experiment. We need to use behavioral science. We need to be willing to say we don't know. We're going to try things. So I think there's a lot of advantage in taking culture more seriously. And these efforts are really nascent, quite honestly, at the moment.
Why do you think more CEOs and executives and boards are not putting more effort into doing these cultural assessments?
It's a really good question. I think, again, we're very, very used to thinking about all this stuff as being about defending corporate value. So we set up a compliance program. We have rules, policies, procedures, whistleblowing lines, and the regulator will leave us alone. We put out a glossy sustainability report and we'll have a nice ESG rating and the investors will leave us alone. We get HR to deal with questions of harassment and discrimination and shut down any litigation, so that protects our reputation, even if there are a lot of people harassing treating junior employees at the top. So all of these views think of ethics as defensive and something that you can delegate. So I think, you know, we are sort of struggling, I think, to adapt to this new world where culture is on full display, where you need to take it seriously, and defaulting to these views that if we just tick the box or delegate these problems, they'll go away. And so I think there needs to be a wider conceptual shift in how we think about ethics. And a lot of the noise out there, frankly, is not helping. If even with the best will in the world, if you tried to follow a lot of this guidance, you'd get into a lot of trouble.
Also in that chapter, you explained that culture can't be corrected simply by replacing the CEO. And you mentioned the Wells Fargo example, where they replaced their CEO 4 times after their fake account scandal. Boeing replaced their CEO 3 times following the grounding of the 737. And I wonder if this also holds true for the board, you know, whether it can change culture, because we've seen here in South Africa what a difference a capable board makes. And we had a reshuffle national power utility, where Nteto Nyati was brought in as a chair. And ever since then, they've made changes, and we've enjoyed the longest period of continuous power in years. So I think,
yeah.
So I wonder if we're placing enough focus on board composition. It seems that we're busy searching for new solutions, and a growing army of practitioners and consultants are trying to wow us with rehashed practices and frameworks and brand new buzz phrases. And I know Climate Week has been birthing a few more of those. So should we, you know, taking on board what we discussed about culture and tone at the top, should we start with the board?
Sure. I mean, I think I had a professor a long time ago who would say you don't change culture by trying to change culture. I've been talking to a mining company that's trying to recover from being involved in 2 disasters within 5 years. And they're sort of asking, how could this have happened? How could the people on the site not have flagged this? And they are really trying to transform their company from the inside out. And it has frankly involved getting rid of a lot of people at the top. So I think we focus a lot in the board discussion on, you know, recently it's been, have we got enough women on the board? Have we got enough people of color on the board? Well, just putting people of certain types in the room is not any guarantee that the conversation is going to get better. Boards are conformist. I have this quote in my book from Nell Minogue about, and she talked about a board member at Enron. And so after the Enron scandal came to light, and someone was like, well, why didn't you say anything? And the board member was like, well, no one else said anything. And so I think part of the reason is we've got these people that are very, very socially adept, very, very good at handling office politics, very good at getting promoted, very good at saying the right thing. Get a load of those people at the top, you're not going to have a good debate. You're not going to kick the risks around. You're not going to, really have psychological safety in the room. You're just going to get a lot of people kind of herding together and being very, very risk averse. And I think we're seeing a lot of that going on. And that's going on despite increasing kind of diversity in other areas. So I think there is a need for board accountability, but I think there is maybe a need to kind of reconfigure what we even expect from a board. I think we need long-term stewardship, not maybe risks and risk focus and rules and controls. And then we also need to think obviously about the relationship between the board and the C-suite. Very often these are the CEO's friends. Very often everyone's still playing golf together and that kind of thing. So this stuff is very, very cozy, and we need more meaningful accountability.
Right. This is my final question now, but it might take a little while to go through. I mentioned at the start of our chat that one of the things I loved about your book is the number of references to organizations who are getting it right. And generally, it's the bad guys that make the headlines, and while we can certainly learn from their mistakes, hearing how people have got it right is far more inspiring and I think more likely to drive change. So do you have some standout examples you can share with us, the organizations or people who haven't just said it, they've actually done it?
Yeah, I mean, I somewhat resist this question because people are always asking me, who's doing a good job, who's a good company, and kind of going back to that Patagonia discussion. I don't think anybody is getting everything right. And then I think even more inconveniently, very often the companies with leading practices are the companies at the edge of a problem. So I'll give you an example. If I want to find a really deep human rights expert, I will probably go to a mining company. Mining companies have enormous human rights impacts. They have to take community relations seriously. They hire PhD anthropologists. They have deep expertise in this area. Who has the worst reputation for human rights? Mining companies. We talked about tech companies, also at the leading edge of a lot of human rights efforts. That's because they have massively consequential social impacts because of their technology. If you want to find leading supply chain practices, you really ought to look at food and apparel companies. Who's got the worst reputation on supply chain? Food and apparel companies. So I tend to think you need to look at specific practices rather than whole companies. And I hesitate to name companies because if you do, it's 1 second later before people start saying, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this and that thing that they have done?
Sure.
That all said, I do have a lot of good examples in the book of what I think are good practices. I start and close the book with the example of Chobani. It's an American yogurt company. It's privately owned, so its life is somewhat easier. It has employee ownership, which I think, by the way, is a really, really good idea. But it also is laser focused on the US food system, including really intractable problems like undocumented workers. And even more impressively, it's managed to hire refugees into really, really Republican parts of the country without suffering the kind of social media backlash you might imagine is going on in America today. So again, I think this comes back to its culture. It's treating workers with dignity and respect. It's been careful in its hiring. It's been careful in its goals and mission. It doesn't feel the need to speak up on every challenge out there. And I think it's getting a lot right. Not to say we can't find problems with this or any other company. So I think this hunt for good companies is somewhat misguided, but we can learn a lot from specific practices that are very, very often at the edge. It's very, very often not the people that we hear about at sustainability conferences putting out their nice PR messages. It's very often the people in the trenches at the front line of a really big controversy that we have the most to learn from. I'm thinking about writing another book actually about this because I think there's a lot in here.
Look at that. So you mentioned the mining companies there, and Rio Tinto was in your book, and they were a company that had undergone a culture audit of over 10,000 employees, which I thought was really interesting. But one thing that stood out was the CEO of Vale, a Brazilian mining company, where he said that his legacy would not be a new mine or a railroad; it would be a company with a new culture, which I thought was really powerful, coming from a mining company. That was wonderful to see. We do have some questions.
Sure.
If we can move to those now. I've not been keeping an eye on these. I've been too busy in conversation. But we've got a question here. What role should long-term investors play in helping short-term C-suite get through the valley of death on reallocating capital budgeting from dirty to less dirty, clean business segments, methods, value proposition, etc.?
What a wonderful question. I mean, I don't know. I think it really kind of depends where the education process is going, or which direction. I certainly think a long-term investor, like a pension fund, like a big asset manager, can really help a company, but those investors need to figure out where they would like those companies to focus. Those investors need to ask rather more difficult questions about internal governance and priorities and innovation, and not just look for ticking the box on ESG scores. So that's kind of one thing. If you would like a company to focus on regenerative agriculture, for example, that's a big investment and it's going to take a long time to pay off. So you need to really understand what that business is doing on capital allocation. You need to make sure that it has a kind of focused and realistic strategy. I've also heard about the education going the other way. So a company really helping to educate, big investors. There's still very typically, it will be the stewardship team that's really cares about ESG issues, and then the main kind of traders still don't. You've got to have a kind of more coherent approach there. You've got to, I think, help investors understand what to look at and what to focus on. And so I think there is an education process that needs to go both ways, but without long-term investors really supporting these things, a lot of companies are going to struggle, because as the question asked, a lot of these things are quite significant costs in the short term. And so to get through that initial phase is proving very, very difficult for many CEOs. I think partly because they're putting out over convenient win-win messaging, but it's also partly because investors are not fully on board.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Another question here is, they say, Alison, you've no doubt a great deal has happened in the world since you finished writing your book. Have the events of 2024 in any way changed your views?
Gosh, I mean, this is going to sound awful. I think in some ways, I think a lot of what I predicted is coming true. I mean, I think the kind of wider reckoning and backlash against ESG is something I talk about. Something that's been really interesting to me, I expected more critiques because I'm ultimately a sustainable, ethical business person. I expected to be critiqued more by conservatives. In fact, they quite like the book. It's ESG insiders. It is the architects of ESG that didn't like the book the most, and where I've had the most pushback. So I am seeing, a need to chart a new path forward. I'm seeing a need to acknowledge that this is a conversation about values at the end of the day. You see a lot of people, including very famous ESG gurus, saying, the problem is this topic has been inappropriately politicized. I think these topics are inherently political and inherently about values. I think the counter argument is that these are political topics that have been, in some cases, inappropriately financialized. We are having a conversation about the role we want business to play in society. That's a normative, values-based conversation. By saying there's always a business case for this, ESG is always a win-win. Just think about all your stakeholders. Just write this nice report and accountability will magically result. These kind of tropes that have become cliches, I think, they might have been helpful a little while ago. I think they've become part of the problem. And I would like to see more members of the responsible business community acknowledging we need to rethink some of this stuff and acknowledging some of these mistakes.
Great, thanks. Another question here. So they say they agree with you absolutely that ethics should be grounded on human rights. How about becoming increasingly aware that until we are mindful of transiency of politicians leading governments, and as a consequence, their plans are mainly based on their period of term of office, do you think this continues, if this continues, will achieve the Millennium Goals given the limited resources?
I mean, things are not going very well on goals set by the UN. And we've got that, we've got this short-termism problem in politics and in business, right? So, I think this is a problem in general. CEO turnover in the US is unbelievably high. So the question of government action versus business action, I think, is a great one. I don't think human rights frameworks solve it entirely. I mean, good luck. If you don't have leverage over the government in question, or the government doesn't have the capacity, the fiscal capacity, the governance capacity to do something about child labor or deforestation, or is too corrupt to do something about these issues, then there's going to be a limit to what the business can achieve. Right. That all said, I think what I like about human rights frameworks is that they are at least coherent about this is the role of the government and this is the role of business. ESG, by contrast, sort of acts in a political vacuum. I do some training for board members in Africa, and I very often introduce ideas of ESG, and people are like, well, what are you supposed to do about renewable energy when the government controls the energy grid, or there isn't this capacity, or there's really high corruption, or you need to work with, so you get these kind of totally sensible, challenging questions coming up really fast. And then I'm like, well, ESG honestly doesn't really think about that. So that's one of the reasons I think to take human rights seriously. But I want to be very, very clear that adhering to human rights principles is not going to solve all your problems out there. So we need to, again, I think, have a more realistic and thoughtful conversation about what we're really expecting.
Okay, wonderful. That was all for the questions. So another couple for me, but simple questions. Can I ask what books are on your reading list? I'll be very interested to see what your where your focus is and your research.
I'm reading it's a new book by John Kay about capitalism I'm actually blanking on what it's called, but it's come out in the last few months, and it really talks about how many of the kind of economic assumptions about how businesses work are not true anymore. Really, I think, kind of transformational book. I'm reading Alex Edmonds' May Contain Lies. I read a lot of behavioral science kind of tomes. I mean, I would advise anyone on the line that has not read Moral Mazes, which is a book from the 80s. It's just so brilliant and so well written, to go and read that. And then there is a German Korean philosopher called Byung-Chul Han. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but he wrote an amazing book called The Transparency Society. He's a philosopher, but he really changed the way I think about a lot of stuff. He has these very, very short, densely written books. There's one called The Burnout Society. They're just beautifully written and really, really thought-provoking. So all of that. And then I'm kind of following the debate going on in real time. I see that Carolyn shared my LinkedIn details in the chat. I have opinions on all of these topics and more pretty much on a daily basis. And I'd love anyone listening to join that conversation.
Yeah. Wonderful, lovely. Thanks so much, Alison. Well, we're kind of, the time is up now, so we'll need to bring the session to an end. So thank you, Alison, for sharing your experiences with us. My hope is that your insights will provide some food for thought to our community, enough that they'll be able to go away and maybe make some small changes in their organisation. I urge our audience to follow Alison on LinkedIn. As you mentioned, Carolyn has posted her details there. They're always entertaining, but also very, a lot of good information in there. And also, please check out Alison's book. It's available widely in print. It's also an audiobook, which is how I used it. So we'll put the links to that on our website so that people can find it there. So thank you again, Alison. I really enjoyed our chat today. I'm so happy I found your book. It's one I'll be referring to often, I'm sure. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing and hearing more from you, especially this book that you may have in the pipeline.
We'll see. Thank you so much, Mark. A wonderful conversation. And thank you so much to everybody on the line. It was lovely to meet you and see your comments. Would love to keep in touch and continue the conversation and hear everybody's